10 years ago, risk capital was so easy to get. Companies got spoiled in the 90s. 5 years ago, it wasn't quite so easy, but it was still easy compared to today. Today, there is very little risk capital for a startup. So one of the things you have to do now is have a culture that is very stingy. You have to figure out how to do as much as possible without spending cash. I had to fire a CEO 2 years ago who couldn't stop taking all his employees out for $50 dinners. You know, you can give awards to employees without spending money and setting a bad example of a culture. And he couldn't get that out of his head. So that's just one example of today, how you have to tighten the belt.
Anybody else? Yes, go ahead.
So 5 years ago was my first time being a CEO of a public company. And at that point, I had no idea about how to interact with investors. The lessons learned in that 5-year time frame, if I were able to go back, I would do a lot of things different at this point. And mainly what I would do is spend a lot more time thinking about and worrying about and communicating with the investors in the company. Really understanding, especially in a public company, you might have a large block of investors that have a lot of control over your company. You really need to understand what their expectations are, how they expect to make money from the company in the long run in detail. And you have to make sure that your plans, as a CEO, you're planning all these great things that are going to happen. If those things don't line up with exactly what your investors think should happen, you're going to have problems.
Anybody else?
I have another question. If you're in the clean energy or the green tech space, a lot of the market opportunities are driven by policy and regulation at various different levels, of course. You guys are CEOs of small companies, a lot of you, startup companies. How do you get your voice heard? How do you know you can crack the market opportunity and get your voice heard, at least within that public space? Because that is a critical element in making sure that you can capture and get into or open up the markets that could be available based on a lot of the policy-related decisions that are made, you know, down in Albany or down in Washington.
I'll start on that, and my comment is informed that will follow by the fact I think it's actually very hard to get that attention. And you can go down to DC and you can meet with your senator or your representative, which we do frequently. But I would actually say it's suicide to form a business around potential implementation of any legislative driver that would enable your technology to suddenly be profitable. If you can be economic in today's environment and legislative drivers provide profitable upside, that might be an interesting business case. But if you're basing your profitability of your technology on whether it's a carbon tax or you're not going to be able to discharge something into streams anymore, I think it's a really risky proposition, because what was supposed to be on the docket in 6 months might be on the docket in 6 years.
Yeah, I echo that. I think you have to have fundamental, basic business elements that work and that make sense irrespective of incentives or the like. And incentives can be the bonus. I'm reminded a number of years ago, I was doing some traveling in Europe, and there was an article in the Financial Times that was responding to an article about the growth of rail traffic, that suddenly rail traffic had taken a big boom. And I was in the solar business at the time, building a plant in Germany, which had major incentives for solar. The letter to the editor responding to this growth in rail traffic pointed out that the European Union had just changed its subsidies for rail. And suddenly rail had become much less expensive. Guess what? People started using it. Policies can change businesses in a heartbeat. And I think you have to have good fundamentals. And, you know, hopefully what Evan has is exactly that. Sounds like it's exciting. And, but yeah, subsidies and the like, let those be the bonuses. Or the alternative, and I did this once, build a business that is directly at subsidies and know that the moment they go away, you're gonna shut the business down. Don't deceive yourself.
Just to continue that. Hello? Yeah. Just to continue the thought process. The reverse is true too, the subsidy and not worrying about the subsidies. In the sense, the same thing that actually Walt brought up related to IP. A big company can come in tomorrow and lobby real hard to the policymakers and say, we don't want that to be listed as one of the allowable technologies that's going to get implemented. So you can't ignore it completely. What do you do under those scenarios? As a small startup company that doesn't have a very big voice in Washington.
Well, in a situation like that, my only advice would be to form a joint venture with a big company. I guess my advice in that situation would be to basically team up with somebody, some big boys, and go that direction, because as a small player you can't fight the battle. Sometimes it's better to become a joint venture with that, and that happens many times in this case. I also wanted to take that, just a little side comment. I think one of the areas that we as a nation have to think about is a national energy policy. And that's an issue that, is not a subject that we're talking about right now, but that has to be dealt with. I was in the Pentagon not too long ago for a government meeting, and one of the comments came out, we have no trouble spending $1.2 trillion to fight in Iraq with questionable results, but we would not make the attempt to have spent $100 billion a year for the energy policy. Had we done that, we wouldn't be sending all the money to the Middle East and then fight the Al-Qaeda after that, which gets money out of that. So we have a circular argument here in that case, but that's a whole separate discussion. And every chance I get on being in any panels and stuff, I bring that issue up. We have to look at what other things we can do as a nation for ourselves.
Well, I'm just going to warn you, don't depend on regulations or subsidies. Let me give you an interesting story. Company I'm involved in board with was nice 4 million sales per year company, breaking even. They learned that the government was going to reduce the amount of sulfur in oil, so there wouldn't be so much sulfur pollution. And the present instruments couldn't measure to the new regulation. They came out with a new instrument that could measure down to 1 part per million in sulfur. And their sales went from 4 million to 12 million overnight. So they said, what's the next problem? Lead in toys. The toy makers wanted to be able to measure lead in the white paint on a doll's eyeball. And they developed an instrument to measure lead down to 0.1 part per million. But the Chinese outsmart them. They're not putting lead in paint anymore. Fortunately, what the company learned in that, they have now transferred to a more realistic sensor business that's not based on regulations, but based on the need of manufacturing. So I hope that will be a better year next year.
Yeah, so I have a very similar experience. In fact, Michael Newell and I both worked on a project where, if you remember back in the 90s, the Clean Air Act amendments were passed. The law was actually enacted, but it was, and Bill Clinton was elected president soon after that. and the EPA was on the uprise, and everybody thought, wow, there's going to be enhanced monitoring, there's going to be huge markets developed for air testing based on this law and based on the new power of the EPA. Guess what? EPA never got around to enforcing any of those regulations. In the meantime, we had developed a new product to do field testing for air contaminants. Luckily for us, we found other applications in emergency response and so on. It's now a $25 million business, but that's the kind of trouble that you can get into. We went so far as to getting a local, a state senator, what was his name? D'Amato. Al D'Amato, yeah. Al D'Amato wrote a letter to the EPA. All it did was get the EPA mad at us. So you got to be careful how you deal with it.
Yes. Yeah, go ahead.
Yes, sorry. All of you guys have tried to raise capital, and I know, contests, pitch things, whatever, you've done all manner of things available to you. What has been the single most effective program you've participated in that helped you actually access capital?
At the very startup level, at the very startup level, I think the most productive is personal networks. And so talking to people who have some ability to put money in, and then they start talking to their friends, and they talk to their friends, and then you build up a way to bring the initial money in. That doesn't get you the 10 or 15 or 50 million that you might need, but it's good enough to get you going.
Along those lines, I tie in. I made a comment about professional and job counseling. It's continuing to work the network, and you've got a network you've built over your career, however short or long it might be, and it is the connections. Ultimately, it's the people that will bring you the connections to get the real capital in, and it's people that have known you, that have confidence in you, that will say, "I think you ought to talk to so and so." And I mean, I personally haven't had the positive experience that Evan had in terms of competition per se. I've done presentations and panels, and that's opened up doors. Usually those are doors that simply open up other doors, and you keep walking through those doors. And it's a tough, long process, but that's the effort that my experience says it takes.
Thanks. As I said, when we started out in the summer of 2008, the thought was we'd go and try to raise $5 million from venture capitalists. And I had not done that before, which is one of the reasons Ted came to help. And we talked to a lot of them, but it became very clear in the fall with the economic downturn that we better have a plan B because it was going to be a long, hard road. And plan B for us was angel investments and going to NYSERDA to get grants. The company had gotten one small grant early on from NYSERDA. Fortunately, there was a pond that came up. We applied for and won, and that was really fortunate for us in helping the company move forward. And we've continued to do that and developed a great relationship with NYSERDA. And I think it's because we perform on our contracts as we say we're going to perform. We keep the company moving forward. So that was one part of it, and then the other part of it was finding angel investors in and out of the area, and that goes back to the whole idea of networking and continue to pitch whenever you get an opportunity to pitch your company and business plan competitions or the New York forums that go on, but keep your company name out there, and eventually you run into folks who agree that it's a great idea and want to be part of it.